Good day. Today, 16th January 2023, we see continued conflict in Ukraine and in the Middle East, signs of a conflict developing in the Korean Peninsula between North Korea and South Korea, with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, apparently speaking about North Korea altering its constitution to designate South Korea an enemy, which would be an ominous development. And of course, the festering crisis in Taiwan, where the election over the weekend has probably accelerated a drift towards a confrontation between the United States and China over the future of Taiwan. And there's been a cluster of economic news in Europe. There are signs that, there's confirmation that the Eurozone economy is now in recession. The British economy is not in great shape either. There's been an opinion poll, a large opinion survey, which suggests that Britain's current Conservative government is heading for a massive electoral defeat some point this year. And there's also been more political developments in the United States, where Donald Trump has won a resounding victory in the Iowa caucuses, making it more likely that he will become the Republican Party's nominee for the presidency in the general election, which is happening in the United States in November. All of this in conditions of heightened partisan conflict in the United States, all kinds of frightening talk about what the prospect of a Trump victory might mean. Frightening talk, by the way, which I am not myself in agreement with, but there we are. So a very tense, very difficult situation around the world. But again, in this program, I'm going to concentrate on the two big conflicts that are taking place. And again, as I traditionally do, I'm going to start with the conflict in Ukraine, which, without in any way denying the seriousness of the conflict in the Middle East and its potential to go horribly wrong, for the moment at least, it is the conflict in Ukraine that is the bigger conflict in geopolitical terms, the one which is causing greater changes and stresses in the international system. So what can we say today about the state of the conflict in Ukraine? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to return to the topic that I discussed at some length yesterday, which is the topic of the Ukrainian claims that they managed to shoot down a Russian Beriev A-50 AWACS aircraft. And, the Ukrainians are now admitting, or appear to be admitting, that their previous claims to have shot down an Ilyushin 22 electronic intelligence aircraft flying over the Sea of Azov, that those claims were wrong, and they concede that the aircraft was able to make an emergency landing and that it is intact, though they also say that the damage is so severe that this aircraft is going to be a write-off. Well, yesterday I said that I would wait for more news about the situation with the Beriev A-50, and there has been no news. No further news about the Beriev A-50. You would not think that, reading some of the articles that have been appearing in the Western media. I noticed that The Guardian was talking about the other day being a disastrous day for Russia, with the loss of the A-50 and the Ilyushin 22. I'm not convinced that it would have been any kind of disaster even if both of these important aircraft had in fact been shot down. But as it happens, we also know that the Ilyushin 22 managed to limp back and land safely at a Russian airport. And to repeat again, we have no confirmation whatsoever that a Beriev A-50 has in fact been lost. There's been attempts to claim that this is what has happened. The Guardian, in my opinion, really rather inappropriately, took the very same comments by Dmitry Peskov that I discussed yesterday. The ones in which he said, Peskov said, that the Kremlin has no information about any planes being missing, which I said looked to me to be, in effect, a denial. Anyway, The Guardian, in an article, turned that round and made it appear an admission that the aircraft had indeed been shot down. It implied that Peskov said that the Kremlin has no information about how Ukraine shot these two aircraft down. Unless TASS is misreporting Peskov's words, which I do not believe to be the case, then this is not what Peskov said. He did not say that the Kremlin has no information about these two aircraft being shot down. What he said was that the Kremlin has no information that Russian aircraft have been shot down. But the Guardian story, again, shifts the language, makes a denial appear to be an admission. And of course, there's always the usual Russian telegram channels, the comments that Russians have made, which various Russian commentators have made, which is taken as confirmation that the Ukrainian claims must be true. Though it's important to stress that, as far as I can tell, none of these Russian channels that have been talked about are in any conceivable sense official ones. We don't know how well informed these Russian channels are. More than likely, to the extent that any Russians of any kind have supposedly confirmed the story, they're taking their information from what the Ukrainians themselves have said. This has happened many, many times. I give one example back in May, when the Ukrainians first launched their counterattacks in the Bakhmut area following the fall, well, in fact, in advance of the fall of Bakhmut, all sorts of claims about huge Ukrainian advances circulated for roughly 2 weeks. I recall that there were claims appearing, apparently confirmed, or indeed, in fact, supposedly confirmed by Yevgeny Prigozhin. He did actually say that this was the case, that the Ukrainians had recaptured the village of Berkhovka. And of course, that wasn't true. None of that was true. But of course, the Western media seized on these supposed Russian admissions to make it appear that it was, in fact, true. Russian telegram channels, even the best of them, sometimes get things wrong, and more often than not, when they do, it is because they rely or they take their information from Ukrainian reports. And this happens a great deal in this war, and we must not assume that any telegram channels that are supposedly confirming the story actually have any information other than that which the Ukrainians themselves are providing. The only actual evidence that there was a shoot down of a Beriev A-50 that I've seen so far from Ukraine is that I've now seen the graphic, the sort of film of the supposed bleeps on the radar screens, which General Zaluzhny provided, which appear to show these two aircraft disappearing from radar view. And I have to say, it looked extremely unconvincing to me, to put it mildly. It did not look to me like the kind of thing I would expect to see on a radar screen. It all looked to me as if it could be quite easily confected later. I'm not saying it was, mind you. All I am saying is that I wouldn't treat it as evidence of actual wreckage, of sign of damage on the Sea of Azov, quite a shallow sea, by the way, of signs that the Russians were carrying out rescue missions over the Sea of Azov, signs of debris, anything of that kind. As at the time of making this program, I have seen absolutely nothing. I'm just saying that. And to reiterate again, the only official comments that we've had about this incident from the Russian side are Dmitry Peskov's, which, to say it straightforwardly, appear to me to be a denial of the story, not in any way a confirmation of it. So I think that's all I can say for the moment. I think for the moment, the story about the A-50, we put a huge question mark against it. I would have thought that given the importance that some people are attaching to this story, if there was some evidence of this successful shoot down of this aircraft, we would by now have had some confirmation from some source that this had happened. But I'm going to wait a week. If no confirmation appears in a week's time, that will be the point when I decide to bury the story and simply move on. I'm just going to finish with just a few further general observations about this. The first is that simply assuming in a war that what one side claims to have happened is what has actually happened is never a wise thing to do. The Ukrainians have made many claims at many times over the course of this war, which have turned out to be wrong. The ghost of Kiev, the victory at Snake Island, the tactical redeployment from Mariupol, which was really a mass surrender, the heroic defense of Bakhmut and of Solidar, long after the Russians had captured both of these places, the refusal to acknowledge that Marinka has just been captured by the Russians. All these are examples of this. And on the Russian side, I have to say straight away that there have also been examples when we've had reports, not so much, it must be said, from the Russian Defense Ministry or indeed from the Kremlin, but there have been stories that have been appearing on Russian Telegram channels which claim all kinds of things which turned out to be wrong. So Siversk, twice captured in August 2022, it is still under Ukrainian control, even as I make this program. Sinkovka, captured, well, I've no idea how many times. It is still mostly under Ukrainian control. All of these things. So one should preserve always a degree of skepticism, and there was no sign of that in the British media specifically, and in the Western media in general yesterday. All these Ukrainian claims immediately accepted as true, and as I said, Peskov's words distorted to give the impression that they were indeed true. So, as a journalistic practice, I have to say, I think that is exceptionally bad. The second is this. Clearly, if an A-50 has been shot down, and for the moment, I don't know one way or the other, I'm starting to lean against that theory, but, I'm not positive that it hasn't happened. But even if an A-50 has indeed been shot down, then it is certainly a humiliating and damaging blow for the Russians, but it is hardly a fatal one. It is not a disaster, as some people are trying to represent it. The Russians have other aircraft of this kind. They need to work out how the Ukrainians were able to do this, and we'll come to that in a moment. But certainly it is not a disaster when you are Russia and you have the enormous resources that the Russians have, and that you can produce more aircraft like this, and are in fact doing so, and when you are in a position to take precautions to make sure that it doesn't happen again. There have been many claims, especially in the Western media, about Ukrainian victories, and they have repeatedly turned out to be ephemeral. And it is disappointing again that people are seizing on an incident of this kind, and instead of acknowledging that events like this kind do happen in wars, aircraft get shot down, ships get hit, that sort of thing, it doesn't necessarily tell us what the direction, what the actual direction of the war is. Instead of acknowledging that, we see people jumping to all kinds of radical conclusions about some big, decisive event in the war. And the third thing I'm going to say relates to the Ilyushin 22. Now, the Ukrainians very clearly and demonstratively said right at the start that this aircraft had been shot down. They then had to retract that claim when the photographs appeared of the aircraft landing. Already that tells us that the original Ukrainian story that two aircraft had been shot down is wrong. One of the aircraft that the Ukrainians said had been shot down, it turns out, and this is now confirmed, was not shot down. So the Ukrainians are trying to say that the aircraft has been damaged beyond repair and is likely to be a write-off. That might be true, but again, I don't think we have anything like sufficient evidence to say it. It is the case that the Ilyushin 18, upon which, the aircraft upon which this advanced electronic intelligence gathering aircraft is based, is an old aircraft. It's first produced by the Soviet Union in the 1950s. It's an exact analog of the Lockheed Electra, another turboprop-powered passenger aircraft, which is still used by the United States military for similar intelligence gathering aircraft to this day. It is also true that the Russians are apparently working on a replacement based possibly on the Tupolev 204, which is a much more advanced, much more modern jet-powered aircraft, which is now re-entering production. Having said that, I would have thought that electronic intelligence gathering aircraft are valuable items. The replacement is still some way off. I would have thought that the Russians, if they can repair this aircraft, this Ilyushin, they will do so. And I did see a theory, and I really want to stress this is just a theory that was circulating yesterday. It's not by any means confirmed, but it does seem to me to have some plausibility to it, that in fact the only Russian aircraft that got caught up in this incident was the Ilyushin 22, that the Ukrainians launched a missile. They might initially have thought that what they were striking was a Beriev A-50 much more important aircraft. I have been told by people who know that the radar patterns of the two aircraft are completely different, and I'm sure that is correct. I've also been told by other people that it's not always easy to tell when you're looking at things on your radars exactly what aircraft it is that you are striking at. And, you know, it might have been that they just were striking at an Ilyushin 22, and they got very excited and reported back to Kiev that they'd actually downed a Beriev A-50. And when the facts came out and that it was actually an Ilyushin 22 and that it was only damaged, rather than acknowledge that and accept that the initial claims about shooting down a Beriev A-50 were wrong, the Ukrainians simply doubled down, claimed that they'd shot down both an Ilyushin 22 and a Beriev A-50, and kept the story going on that basis. Just saying. Now, as I said, I'm sure I'm going to get a deluge of emails and comments from all kinds of people explaining how that is either possible or how that is impossible. I've already had people explaining to me that Ilyushin 22s and Beriev A-50 AWACS would not be operating anyway in the same airspace, and that the original Ukrainian story is illogical. Please don't expect me to be the person who knows about these things in advance. I will read whatever comments people make about this topic with great interest, and I will take an awful lot of information from it. And that will help improve my commentary in future. Now, this incident does, however, bring us back to this question of how it is possible for the Ukrainians to launch missiles, air defense missiles, at targets, at aircraft flying over the Sea of Azov. This is a place, a location where one would expect Russian aircraft to be able to operate without being at risk of interception from Ukrainian ground-launched missiles, even ground-launched missiles like the Patriot, which are just about the longest range missiles that the Ukrainians have. Now, something rather like this was happening a few weeks ago in Kherson region. I discussed this before, that the Ukrainians claimed that they had launched and shot down several Russian fighter bombers, Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers. There was only, in the end, confirmation of the loss of one of these fighter bombers. I'm just saying. But the Ukrainians claimed to have shot down several, and the British Defence Ministry in the end decided that the number that they had shot down was 3, and if you follow Ukrainian and Western accounts, that's now the accepted story, even though, again, we have no actual confirmation, independent confirmation of that claim. And it is widely acknowledged that what the Ukrainians did was that they moved air defense missiles into Kherson region, to the west bank of the Dnieper. They deployed a Patriot battery to Kherson region with expensive and powerful and very long-range Patriot batteries, missiles. And bear in mind that the Patriot is not really a mobile system, but they were able to ambush at least one Russian fighter bomber in that way. And the claim that is being made is that this is exactly what the Ukrainians did in terms of intercepting Russian aircraft over the Sea of Azov. They moved a Patriot battery, perhaps only one battery, This battery may have been operating without many of its other components, without the radars. It was provided with signals, maybe from other radars. There are some disturbing claims that some of the Western reconnaissance aircraft that regularly overfly the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov were providing data to this missile battery, that this is how the two Russian aircraft, or one Russian aircraft, were tracked, and this is how the attack was made. Of course, that means that a Patriot missile battery, again, has been deployed very close to the contact line. Now, when this happened in Kherson region, according to various reports, which seem to be true, there are various confirmations of this, nothing conclusive, but it does seem to be true. When this happened in Kherson region, eventually the Russians, who then launched a hunt to find this Patriot missile battery, did so. They found it being loaded onto a train. The train was attacked, the Patriot missile battery was destroyed, and many of the operators who were there were destroyed with it. And I suspect that the Russians are now busy doing exactly the same thing. They're probably now, even as I'm speaking, hunting that Patriot missile battery that was used in the attack over the Sea of Azov, and perhaps, or perhaps not, they will track it down, and they will, if they do track it down, destroy it as well. So that's probably in part how it was done. Now, there has been a very interesting email which has been sent to me by somebody who's provided me with a great deal of help over the last couple of months. Again, I'm not going to disclose who this person is, but he has touched on something which I have also read in other media sites and Telegram channels and wherever, that the Ukrainians, one of the things that they have been doing is that they've established a network of people inside Russia who monitor flights from Russian bases and who report back to presumably Kiev when they see Russian aircraft take off from these bases, and that this information then gets relayed to the Ukrainian Air Defense Command. That means that they are expecting these aircraft to come, and then at that point, when the aircraft do eventually arrive, it means that the Ukrainians have knowledge and foreknowledge of the presence of these aircraft, and perhaps a general idea of where they are, of where they're going to be. And this makes these ambush operations easier to undertake. Now, that could very well be true. It's been suggested that the Serbs were doing something similar during the 1999 Yugoslav bombing war that NATO carried out. What I would say is that, of course, any operatives working in Russia and providing information to Ukraine are engaging in a very, very high-risk activity for themselves. The Russians will undoubtedly be hunting these people. Sooner or later, they will probably find most of them, and they will break up these networks, assuming, of course, that they exist at all. Every so often, we've had pictures of which appear to come from close to Russian air bases. So it's likely that there are some operatives working out there. There was even a picture a few weeks ago of somebody loading a canister or something like that into the engine of a Sukhoi 34. I'm told, by the way, that this would have done some damage to the aircraft, but would certainly not have destroyed it. But anyway, there we go. So there is probably some of this going on. I would, however, say that we can't guess the scale, and it might be that this story is being circulated again in order to create the idea that there is this large network of people operating in Russia, and to get the Russians to divert resources to tracking down and closing down these non-existent networks, and possibly, just possibly, Ukraine knows about the taking off of Russian aircraft because they've been provided by that information by the Western powers through their formidable reconnaissance systems. I have no way of knowing about this one way or the other. But anyway, this game of cat and mouse with with Patriot missile complexes, if this is indeed what is going on, it can only win temporary victories, if that's what they are, for Ukraine. And it is doing so at the risk of loss of Patriot missile batteries. And there's been multiple reports now that several of these batteries have been destroyed over the last few weeks, and that losses of Patriot missile batteries are mounting. And there was also a report some months ago, I remember, when 4 Russian aircraft were shot down in apparently a similar way, or so the story goes, in the northern area, on the northern borders of Russia, that the Americans were not happy that their Patriot missiles were being used in that kind of way, and that they had placed a temporary stop on it, though apparently they've now, or supposedly they've now reversed that decision. Let me go back to the point that I have made many times now in recent programs. What the Russians are doing is that they are engaging the Ukrainians in aggressive attrition. They are causing attrition to the Ukrainians right across the battlefronts. And even if an expensive, complex Beriev A-50 was shot down by Ukraine, the Russians can replace it. If Ukraine is putting Patriot missile batteries at risk, expending Patriot missile interceptors on these ephemeral victories, if their Patriot missile batteries are being destroyed at an accelerating rate because they are engaging in these practices, then in effect, whatever temporary gains the Ukrainians might achieve, they are playing into the Russian agenda. They are, in effect, allowing the Russian policy of aggressive attrition to be more successful. I think this is a point that I do want to make, so I don't think it is widely understood. Use of Storm Shadow missiles over the Black Sea to hit the odd bridge there, that's when the missiles even get through, or the odd amphibious landing warship, or an empty building in Sevastopol. What it is doing is depleting the total of Storm Shadow missiles when these are no longer in production, and misuse of Patriot missiles in this kind of operation at a time when the Russians are launching missile strikes right across Ukraine and have active production lines producing more and more and more missiles. Again, that really doesn't make much sense when the total number of missile interceptors is in short supply, and when Ukraine is going to have increasing problems getting replacements for its Patriot missile interceptors. So, this is all I'm going to say about this incident. We will probably get more news at some point over the next couple of days, or perhaps not. We shall see. If I have any reason to revisit this topic, I will do so. Now, what else is going on the battlefronts? Well, Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, he's still there. He was supposed to retire, years ago, but apparently there's been disagreement about his potential successor, so he's still soldiering on. Anyway, he's now come along. He's admitted that the situation on the battle lines is extremely difficult, that things are not going well for Ukraine. Though, of course, he makes it clear that the West must still go on supporting Ukraine as it has always done. And in fact, that sums up the situation at the moment. The Russians continue to put growing pressure on the Ukrainians everywhere along the entire line of control. There seems to be a renewed push by the Russians in the Kupiansk area, so I understand more pressure on Sinkovka. There is a lot of fighting going on around Bakhmut, west of Bakhmut, as the Russians continue to push forward towards Chasiv Yar and the canal that lies just ahead of it. And there are accumulating reports that the Russians are continuing the process, the gradual process of encircling Avdiivka. They're pushing their forces up the railway northwards towards Ocheretine. They are apparently in control of something like 2/3 of Stepovoye. So far, from what I understand, Ukrainian counterattacks in this area have not been successful. The Russians are now apparently anticipating a further build-up of Ukrainian troops in Berdichi, the village to the west of Stepovoye. As I said, that exposes those troops to further attrition, which is what the entire Russian campaign at the moment is all about. And the Russians are also on the move further south in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area. Though here the Russian advances have been gradual. They've not been making any serious attempts to engage the Ukrainians in force, because gradually, step by step, the Ukrainians are being pushed back. And as always, the Russians conduct the war with a policy of conserving their own forces. And perhaps in some ways, for the Ukrainians, alongside this escalating crisis in Avdiivka and perhaps their increasing problems west of Bakhmut, perhaps an even more worrying place for the Ukrainians is Marinka. Having captured Marinka, the Ukrainians have, by the way, going back to what I was saying earlier in this program, they've never, as far as I know, formally acknowledged that Marinka has indeed been captured by the Russians. Anyway, having captured Marinka, the Russians are steadily now moving towards the capture of Georgievka to the west of Marinka, and they are slowly, or perhaps not so slowly, they are quite quickly actually tightening their grip over this village of Novomikhailovka. And let me once again say, this is a policy not of seeking a big breakthrough in any particular part of the front line. It is aggressive attrition, obliging the Ukrainians to go on expending their limited stocks of ammunition, obliging the Ukrainians to keep more and more of their army on the combat line. Attempts to carry out the further mobilization that we've been hearing so much about are, for the moment at least, at a total standstill. even as the Russians steadily build up their forces. And we've had more pieces of information about this. There's lots of pictures now in Russia of the latest Russian artillery system, the Koalitsiya self-propelled gun being trundled out. And we're told that this gun, and it looks pretty formidable, by the way, that this gun is longer range than not just other Russian 152 millimeter guns, significantly longer range than other Russian self-propelled guns of this kind, but it is Russian guns, but that it is actually longer range than any Western 155 millimeter gun in the Ukrainian arsenal. And more to the point, apparently it's a highly automated system. It can fire many more rounds in a shorter period of time than any other self-propelled gun system in the world. It was first displayed by the Russians in prototype form at a military parade in 2015. Apparently, there's been a long, protracted, complex development period, but development finally was completed in October, and it is now in full series production, and the first batches have been distributed to the troops. And it will add to the weight of Russian artillery on the combat line. And this is just one of many new types of weapons that the Russians are producing. And of course, they're producing more weapons all the time. And they are also inducting more and more men into their army. My understanding is that the Russian army has recruited by now 500,000 men since the 1st of January 2023. So the Russian army is becoming bigger and bigger all the time. And the same person who provided me with some information about the way in which the Ukrainians might have been successful in shooting down Russian aircraft, shuttling their Patriot systems around the battlefronts. Same person has made the point to me that the Ukrainian lines are now becoming dangerously thin. The Ukrainians are not only having to keep most of their troops on the front lines, but of course those troops are becoming tired. Their numbers are becoming less. It's becoming more and more difficult for the Ukrainians to hold their positions on the front lines. It's becoming more difficult every day. And this person has pointed out that if the Russians were to launch the big offensive in the north that some people think they will, in the Sumy, Chernigov region, either towards Kharkiv, conceivably even towards Kiev itself, with Ukrainian lines now so overstretched, the Ukrainians would be forced to make some very difficult decisions about which areas of territory they must hold and which they need to abandon, given that in the event of a Russian offensive on any big scale in the north, and this person has given a figure of 250,000 men being committed to this offensive, which would be, by the way, many orders of magnitude bigger than the Russian offensive in the Sumy, Chernigov, Kiev area that was launched in February, March 2022. Anyway, given the lack of men and machines that Ukraine has to hold positions in the north, Ukraine might have to decide to abandon large stretches of territory in the south in order to presumably repel this offensive in territory absolutely critical to Ukraine, and that might, of course, in turn lead to dramatic outcomes in the war. Now, that's one way in which aggressive attrition might work. I should say that I've also had an email. In fact, I get many emails from this particular member of the community pretty much every day. Anyway, this person, who has a military background, has suggested to me an alternative scenario, closer, I think, to the one that Brian Beletic has, which is that the Russians do not actually need to conduct such a big offensive in any one place, because aggressive attrition is already wearing the Ukrainians down on the contact line. There will come a point when somewhere the line finally breaks, when the Ukrainians are no longer able to hold off the Russians, be it in Avdiivka, be it in Bakhmut, be it in the Marinka, Vuhledar area, be it further north in Kupiansk, wherever. And that once a big breach happens, there will be a cascade effect. And at that point, simply through the continuous application of pressure, the entire front will start to collapse on itself. Well, as I said, I'm not going to try and second guess Russian plans. I think that's a fool's errand. I think that the Russian General Staff, the Stavka, as John Helmer refers to it, as the Russians, many Russians also refer to it, keeps its secrets. We will see how it evolves. But even Stoltenberg can see the problems and is beginning to sound increasingly pessimistic. So what does the West do? Now, in my previous program, I discussed the meeting in Davos, the fact that all these national security advisors from all these countries, global South countries, and brought together by the Americans, by Jake Sullivan, in order to try to persuade them to adopt Zelensky's 10-point peace plan, which is not a peace plan. How this latest meeting in Davos, even according to the British media and Bloomberg, all it could do was provide a photo op showing, who the participants were. And there was complete disagreement. The global South countries very negative about the Zelensky plan, very negative about the whole approach being taken, insisting that the only way forward was for direct negotiations to be started with the Russians immediately. That's the point they've been making since August. Not what the Western powers want to hear, not what the Ukrainians want to hear. Anyway, one way or the other, this was an unsuccessful meeting, but it's a meeting which once again shows the lack of ideas on the Western side about how to end this war in a diplomatic way, how to seek a potential political solution to this war that might conceivably preserve Ukraine. But even as the West has run out of ideas on the diplomatic and political front, in fact, it never has had any on the diplomatic and political front, we can see feverish thinking about how to change the situation on the sanctions side. And the latest plan, outlined in part by Reuters, involves the Russian frozen assets and may give us, probably does give us, a good insight into what some Western officials are apparently thinking. And if I may say, it is a completely crazy idea, one of the strangest, most bizarre ideas I've ever come against. And apparently the plan is this, that it's accepted, it's acknowledged that the Russian assets, the strategic reserves, the central bank reserves held in Clearview, in Belgium, and all of the others, these are Russian assets. But in anticipation of the reparations that one day Russia will have to pay Ukraine, the Ukrainians will issue bonds citing these frozen Russian assets as collateral. So the security for the bonds will be the frozen Russian assets. Now, what gives this whole idea a further twist, at least this is my understanding of it, you have to go a little bit beyond what Reuters itself is saying. But apparently it is expected that the main buyers of these bonds will be Western central banks. The Fed, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England. They will be buying these bonds, and they will be accepting the frozen Russian assets as collateral. Now, this is a completely crazy idea. It is, in legal terms, and I really do wonder what kind of legal advice Western governments, and indeed the Ukrainian government, is being given. But in legal terms, this is actually more dangerous, more risky than simply passing a law and seizing the assets. And the reason it is on its face an even more dangerous idea than simply seizing those assets is actually a very obvious one, because the whole premise of this strange plan is that it in effect acknowledges that those assets, frozen as they are, nonetheless are Russian. In other words, they belong to another, specifically to Russia. And to see what that means, to try and understand what that leads to, let me go to the definition of theft set out in Section 1 of the Theft Act 1968, which defines theft under British law. It says a person is guilty of theft if he dishonestly appropriates property belonging to another with the intention of permanently depriving the other of it, and theft and steal shall be construed accordingly. So, guilty of theft, a dishonest appropriation of property belonging to another with the intention of permanently depriving the other of it. Isn't that exactly what is being proposed here? First of all, there is the straightforward admission that the property belongs to another, to Russia, in fact. As I said, the idea of using Russian assets as collateral for Ukrainian bonds, in effect, concedes that the assets are Russian. So it clearly is another person's property. And it means there has to be an appropriation of that property. Well, if you are using someone else's property as if it were your own, by putting it forward as collateral to borrow against it, that is an appropriation of that property. You are treating it as your own. Instead of, say, taking out a loan on your house, it's like taking out a loan on someone else's house. You are treating that other person's house as if it were your own house. And you're clearly doing it dishonestly, because you are doing it without the agreement of that other person. In the case of the house, you're not getting the agreement of the house owner. In the case of Russia, you're not getting Russia's agreement. In fact, the Russians would vigorously contest this. They're already putting together a powerful legal team, apparently, in order to contest it. And last but not least, you're doing it with the intention of permanently depriving the other of it. Because how else can it happen if you're dishonestly appropriating someone else's asset? If the Ukrainians are using Russian assets as collateral in order to float bonds, then ultimately they must assume that at some point through some process, those bonds will be paid over to them so that they can secure the collateral. And in fact, we know that the plan is that this will be done on the basis of some kind of reparations scheme. And of course, if Ukraine were to default on its bonds, which would be highly likely, then the bond holders, presumably the central banks, would have the right to seize those Russian assets if they were to accept this strange arrangement. So this is an arrangement which fulfills all the classic definitions of theft. It has an even weirder quality because it not only fulfills the definitions of theft, but it actually, if the bond buyers are going to be central banks, it makes the central banks of the West, in effect, accessories. They would be involved in the theft of Russian assets by buying bonds secured against Russian assets without Russia's agreement. Some might even say that the central banks of the West, the Federal Reserve Board, the ECB, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, you could even call it, perhaps, if you wanted to, a case of money laundering. And, of course, what it actually amounts to, because presumably the bonds would be issued and the central banks would buy them, but for the time being at least, the frozen Russian assets would remain in clear view, in other words, in the institutions which currently hold them. What it actually amounts to is further money printing in order to support Ukraine. I cannot understand how Western governments, the Ukrainian government, can possibly be getting legal advice to enact this scheme. I do not understand how this can be justified in legal terms. It's a complicated scheme, as in fact schemes often are, but in essence, despite all of its apparent complexities, in its legal essence, it is very simple, and so simple that one would suppose that a court would be able to see through it right away. And of course, the court in question would presumably be the International Court of Justice. It's unlikely, I would have thought, to be any of the domestic courts, because what would have been done by governments and, in other words, by states, and this would be a case of interstate conflict, and I would have thought that the ICJ would in that case be engaged. I mean, again, I'm not an expert on this, so on this issue perhaps I am wrong. But anyway, I have to say, this seems to me like a crazy idea. And if Western governments, and of course the Ukrainian government, are really going down this track, then I think they do need to take a step back and seek further advice from lawyers, not just whichever lawyers they are consulting, but perhaps the wider legal community, so that they can get clearer advice about what it is precisely that they are attempting to do. Now, of course, it could be that Western governments, the Ukrainian government, really don't care, that they say to themselves, well, the law may be the law, but we make the law. After all, that's what the rules-based international order is all about. We are the people who make the rules, and we just decide what those rules are, and we enact them, and whatever we decide, that automatically makes it legal, because we are the West, and the rules-based international order is based upon what we do. Well, that might be what they are thinking, but of course, the rest of the world is not going to agree with this. They will see through it just as easily as any court would presumably do. They would see how dangerous it was. The very fact that it is a scheme in some ways makes it even more dangerous. People tend to be even more alarmed by schemes, in my experience, than by straightforward seizures. And bear in mind that a scheme, but by definition, acknowledges that there is a major problem. So it's in effect a virtual admission that what you're trying to do is illegal. But anyway, that's how it would appear, as I said, to most people around the world. And I think the consequences of doing something like this will be simply terrible. And again, I would like to believe that the very intelligent people, I know that some of them are very intelligent, who are to be found within the central banks in the West, would strongly advise against this scheme, and would be telling Western governments that, if you want to do this, well, go ahead, it's nothing to do with us. But don't expect us to have anything to do with it. Anyway, we shall see. We're now a couple of weeks away from this decision, half-baked from a decision as to whether or not to seize the assets. We'll see if this half-baked, crazy scheme is the way they choose to go. Maybe this whole thing has been put together to confuse, and maybe Western governments are actually thinking of something else. Anyway, we shall just have to wait and see. That is where I finish my program about Ukraine today. As I said, a strange story about the A-50, aggressive attrition applying on the battlefronts every day. And as I said, an absolutely preposterous scheme, incredibly dangerous scheme to try to seize assets, Russian assets, which, far from providing legal cover for the seizure of these assets, actually simply makes more blatant the illegality. There is that other crisis, which is the one in the Middle East, and here I'm afraid the situation is getting ever more ominous. Firstly, as nobody should be surprised, the Houthis are continuing to do that which they threatened to do. They've launched missile strikes against American warships, So far, none of those missiles have got through, but they've apparently launched more attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. So they have not been deterred in any way. But another party in the Middle East has now made a move, and that party is Iran, and it has launched missile strikes against targets in the Kurdish city of Erbil in Iraq. Now, these strikes are said to be in retaliation for the bomb attack, or rather, I understand, suicide bomb attack on the people who had gathered near the tomb of General Soleimani in Iran when, as I said, there were these explosions and hundreds of people were killed. So this is supposed to be a retaliation for that attack. And the targets near Erbil seem to be, from what I can tell, focused upon agents and entities that have been involved in some way in trying to foment internal discord within Iran. It is likely, or at least I suspect, that the Iranians think that some of the people who they have targeted are American assets, and they have described one target that they struck at as a Mossad base. I have no way of knowing one way or the other, and I'm not going to spend time discussing that in any more detail. The key point to note, however, is that the Iranians have not specifically targeted American bases. They have not gone after Americans in these attacks, and from what I can tell, no Americans were killed or injured over the course of them. So, what were the Iranians up to? Well, obviously, they were going after people who they see as dangerous to themselves. They were also retaliating for the attack near the tomb of Soleimani, which killed all those hundreds of people. But clearly they were up to something else. They were giving a warning of their own to the Western powers, principally to the United States and Britain, that Iran is prepared to defend itself, and they were engaging in a show of force, demonstrating, at least to some extent, their capabilities, their ability to launch missiles on a target deep in Iran and to hit that target with a great deal of precision. And they have been signaling to the United States and to Britain that if there are missile strikes on Iran, Iran has missiles of its own, at least as powerful as those that the United States has, arguably more powerful than the ones that the United States has. I mean, the Tomahawk cruise missiles, which equip US warships, powerful weapons, but rather old weapons in their original form, dating back to the 1970s. Obviously, they've been repeatedly updated since then, but they don't perhaps have the full power of these ballistic missiles, which is what Iran is launching, and of course also the drones that Iran was launching as well. So the Iranians are signaling that they have the means to defend themselves and that they're prepared to use it. And they're telling the Americans and the British, look, if you are thinking of launching strikes at us, and comments made by some Western officials, especially British officials, do point in that direction. Commentaries published by former American officials like John Bolton definitely point in that direction. If you're really thinking of that, if you're really climbing up this escalatory escalator by launching those strikes against the Houthis and saying that this is a warning to Iran, well, be aware that we in Iran have the means to defend ourselves and don't go there. So that's, I think, what this warning implies. Now, whether you think that this is going to diffuse the situation in the Middle East, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me it might do. It could conceivably deter some people in Washington and London. I would have thought more likely it's going to provoke them even further. They will say that the reason these Iranians are conducting these strikes is because they're putting on a show of force on behalf of their allies, the Houthis. This proves that the Houthis are simply a proxy of Iran. It also proves that Iran is not prepared to back down. So therefore, what we must do is go after Iran. So I can easily see that calculus also at play. Overall, the mere fact that warnings of this kind have to be given, that steps like this are being taken, this is a very negative sign. It shows how tense and dangerous the situation in the Middle East has become and how very, very risky it now is, and how the possibilities of a further escalation are becoming very real. And I'm going to suggest that the latest electoral developments in the United States have the potential to intensify these risks still further, because the results of the Iowa caucuses heighten the probability that Donald Trump will eventually become the Republican Party's nominee in the general election. And given the reaction of most of the American political class, the entire Democratic Party, and many people in the United States to the prospects of a Trump presidency, well, one can see how that might in itself be a cause of great tension and stress within the United States at a time when the United States is engaged in this proxy war with Russia in Ukraine and is losing there, and is trapped into a potential proxy war with Iran, which might escalate into an outright war in the Middle East. And in my experience, people who are stressed and tense and perhaps even frightened are more likely to make mistakes, to act from fear and anger and from other emotions, and to do things which subsequently turn out to be very unwise. I can't help but look upon everything that is going on with growing foreboding. I think that there are ways back. I think a diplomatic initiative, contacting the Russians, seeing what can be talked about with the Russians, both about the situation in Ukraine and about the situation in the Middle East, is now urgent. I think going down dangerous pathways like providing long-range missiles to Ukraine, which some people in the West are advocating, as I discussed in a recent program. Dmitry Medvedev, the vice chairman of the Russian Security Council, has warned people about the potential implications of that. Anyway, coming up with those dangerous ideas, other dangerous ideas like the scheme I talked about with the Russian assets. None of this helps. It makes the situation more intractable and more dangerous, well, what you really need to do is to start talking to the Russians, not trying to threaten and embarrass and humiliate them. And the same applies to the Middle East. There are diplomatic ways forward, but they are not being followed. And anyway, we will see where all of this is going, but it seems to me that even as things become riskier and more dangerous, Western policy is only working towards making the situation riskier and more dangerous still. Well, this is where I end my program today. Thank you for joining me in this program. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where we have amazing things available, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, sweatshirts, t-shirts, and all of those great things. We are, by the way, holding a sale. There's a 15% discount on sales of shirts, just saying, on our shop. And in the meantime, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.